So what the reason that we're just talking about this today is to introduce some of the ideas which will show up in the training, which will be, I think the way we're doing it is we're doing six sessions over 3 weeks, so we can get like 3.5 hours per session, so we can introduce a lot of the foundation of what business architecture is all about. And I know that many organizations have used the approaches that we advocate, and a lot of it is embedded in QualiWare anyway, and is quite implementable in QualiWare. And as Kevin has mentioned, there's a book coming out on supposed to be March 3rd is the release date. We're still actively doing final edits to sort of capture a lot of this type of stuff. So it's a bit timely that we're able to do this. But what I'm going to talk about now is some of the key aspects of what's going to show up there. And by the way, don't be afraid to jump in and ask questions as we're doing this. But I think ultimately, really what we're trying to do with business architecture is sort of turn that those really interesting statements of strategic intent, which everybody's like sort of like the hope, but how do you turn that hope into something operational and usable? So we're going to talk about how this business architecture approach is going to do that. And right now, I'll say that my view on business architecture is not just the structural aspects of 4 or 5 model types. It's really something where you start with why you do things and you go all the way through until you're making it happen. It's a slightly broader view than what a lot of people have, but I feel that it's not about models. The models are a tool to help us to get to better ways of actually operating and running our organizations. So you've heard about me, but and I think that this whole idea, how do you turn a dream into a reality is what we're talking about. And this little Stephen Covey type quadrant here is an interesting one. It's really about the separation of ends and means. A lot of business architecture talks a lot about means, all the things you have to have. It talks about processes and capabilities and data and things like that. But that's just a means to an end. So the ends, though, if you see in this little quadrant here, if you don't have any intention, don't know where you're going, and you have no means either, you do have a nightmare. But I mean, quite often we start with great statements of where we want to be. The executives are incredibly good at this, with no idea how we're going to get there. And then the executives complain about nobody listens to what they're saying. How come it never came to life, and so on. So really, what we want is we ultimately want the dream, and which is the ends, and we also want the means. This dream is going to come true. This is often where we end up, right? We have everybody focusing on things like business architecture and all kinds of other models, but they have no idea where it's going. Just think, okay, architecture is a good thing, so we'll do architecture. I refer to that as like walking in your sleep. You have no idea where it's going to take you and so on. I want to make sure that we actually get to this top right corner in the things that we're going to talk about. And I hear a lot of people talk about, well, all we have to do as architects is we have to translate those intentions into reality. And I take a bit of an exception to that, because translation means trying to retain exactly what you had. It's really interpretation. And an interpreter doesn't translate. An interpreter actually finds the meaning and turns it into something which is understandable for another group of people. And if you look at all the people who get involved in all the things we're trying to do, you've got business executives, you've got strategists, you've got all the different types of architects, people designing solutions, and there's all these different groups. And the issue is, how do we make sure we don't lose the intention when we're doing the interpretation? Because there's always some sort of interpretation that's taking place. So really what this is going to look like, excuse me for the busy diagram for now, this is sort of the journey that we will go through. It's what the book goes through. It's also what the training goes through. And what it says is that there's a bunch of things we have to do to define what the business is all about. There's a number of things we have to do to design the business, which a lot of traditional architects sort of play in here. But also it's an issue of how do we actually turn that into something which is priority, do the right things, and basically make sure we deliver what we promised. Ultimately is where we live happily ever after, where we sort of execute, measure, monitor, and so on. I'm just going to use one slide in each of these four sort of to tell you how that goes. So this first part is defining the business, is understanding the business model. How do we execute? What's our intention? How do we go about doing that? Understand what the external pressures are on the organization. There's lots of them. And understand who's in the outside world who we're serving and who's serving us, the stakeholders. And deriving from all of these, a North Star, a simplified, more elegant version of what success looks like. And also to define the specific strategic capabilities, not to be confused with functional capabilities, the strategic critical factors that have to be in place in order to be successful. The problem we see today is that quite often the strategic intent is not compelling, or nobody believes it, or nobody understands it, or it's too hard to understand, or it's too simple to believe. It's not focused on performance and results. It's just nice, vague statements. For the most part, they're inside out and not outside in, which we should be looking at. And quite a bit of the time, people do this as part of their annual exercise, and when it's done, they check the box and say, yeah, we're done. It's not really something which is really motivating for everybody else. Now, if we really want to do this right, we have to separate the ends from the means. Where we're going from the means, we have to match the means to the ends, which is what good architecture will do for us. We'll make sure we have measurable goals and targeted KPIs so we can actually evaluate how we're doing as we're going. It's going to be external stakeholder driven, not inside, it's not about this department or that department, this other group. There's always some sort of time, a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is. And if you really want to be successful with this, you really have to keep this intention current. You have to sustain it. It's not a project. It's an ongoing way of life, so to speak, and it's communicated all the way through. So this first part is absolutely critical. Quite often missing. We find that we really have people doing architecture work for the sake of doing architecture work, or so it seems. The next block is, again, where a lot of things where people will recognize this. And in this particular one, there's like 4 major components, and there's others, of course, that come into this. But the major ones we see are business information, or a lot of people will call business concepts. What is the business all about? I'm using the word business fairly loosely here for everyone. There's the issue of business processes as well. Now, some of you might call these things value stream stages, and so on, but a good process architecture keeps all that stuff together, from value chains to value streams to stages and so on, regardless of what you want to call them. And of course, we see a lot of emphasis in enterprise architecture around things like business capabilities. But you know what, your capabilities can be great, but if they're not serving the work that's being done, and they're not moving the information and keeping it current and reliable, they're not going to be of much value. And also we tie into this one the issue of business performance. Quite often people don't talk much about performance as a set of models in business architecture as well. But this is where we get into some very, very interesting issues. There have been debates raging for years around methodology. And there's a lot of dogmatism. People come from different backgrounds and they swear that their way is the only way, and you only need one of these. Do I need processes? Do I need capabilities? Is it all about information? They focus on a domain, and they're very much a functional orientation and not a cross-functional orientation connected to outside stakeholders who receive the benefits of all the things that we do and all the things that we build. A lot of focus on doing everything from scratch rather than sharing. And from an executive point of view, is quite often seen as a constraint to getting to solutions, right? So basically then what we find is the executives lose focus. because they don't see how this is going to help them get to the result they're looking for. And so quite often you get people jumping to solutions from problem to solution rather than doing the proper architectural work. And quite often we do this work without real consideration for strategy and without having good decision criteria about what the North Star might be. So we want to do this right. We have to iterate. It takes a while to do this. You can't do any one domain perfectly without interacting with the others. Outside in, big issue around semantics. Big fights over what words mean and how they come together. So that's why conceptual modeling is, or concept modeling is really important. So we have to be traceable to specific goals, and we have to basically make sure we're sharing performance from the end to end, not just in my department, my group, my division, and so on. And it's also critical that we collaborate both back to strategy, but also back to implementation. So we're going to talk about that. Of course, at some point in time, you have to build things. And that's all the way from what are your priorities? And what we're saying is the priorities need to come from the architecture, and they don't come from a functional group inside the organization. So from there, we can build a transformation portfolio, make sure we can actually schedule that out properly, and actually do the building of all the different domains, not just information technology, but including things like workflows, policies, rules, organization, skills, competencies, facilities, locations, information, all that stuff is part of the transformation. This is not an IT play in and of itself, even though if we get good business architecture, IT is going to be much better off. So the risks here, we ignore the strategy. We just do what the loudest person in the room wants, and it's not connected to delivering of value. The value connection has got to be there. And quite often it's dominated by IT needs to build something as opposed to worrying about the other domains. So if we want to get it right, we have to really make sure we have the right models in place and show how they interconnect. So if I have capability, I want to know all the processes that are impacted or use that capability. If I've got a piece of information, I want to know every single place where that's used. And if I change it, I know the impact or change on everything else. It's this impact analysis or avoiding unintended consequences is going to be the key thing. So let's get a couple more slides and then I can open it up. Lastly, this is where we get the benefit. We execute the business. We basically measure the business according to the performance stack, the KPI stack that we build. We start to manage end to end and not just within our functional little group. So, and of course, we can do continuous improvement. But the risks here is that we don't implement well. We easily go back to functional management, and we don't end up with accountabilities for outcomes. So that's the risk if we don't do the other stuff right. Critical success factors, you need performance data. And one of the things that we advocate very strongly is when you're designing your architecture, you need to design the performance management framework. And you also need to design the mechanisms by which you're going to get that data so you can run analytics, gain insights, and make changes on a sustainable basis. So these are some of the things that we see. These are the major building blocks. The training class will take us through and how to do that with practice along the way. So our challenge is we often end up with dysfunctionality because each functional group does their own thing. We basically have to make sure we have traceability. So we know if I touch one thing, I know everything else is affected. We jump to projects before we connected the dots up properly. And reality does get in the way. I mean, that's just the fact of life. There's quite often personal conflicts. Different people have different interests and going to fight each other. Also, I'm sure a lot of you experienced this already. Quite often architecture is seen as an exercise and not a critical part of the mission of the organization. Sometimes it's focused on just getting the budget done, budget for projects, as opposed to making sure we're doing the right thing in the long term. Governance is a critical issue, of course. and communication. And all of this stuff is stuff we're going to deal with. So
That's great.
you can take me off the screen now, but that's basically what we're going to go with. Do we have any questions?
Thank you very much for that, Roger. That's really helpful.